How did a decade of apparent prosperity for American farmers turn into a full-blown crisis?
We have to understand that the roots of this crisis run deep. They go all the way back to the decades after World War II.
So we need to set the stage right. Take us back to those post-war years.
After World War II, American farmers were hailed as heroes. The arsenal of democracy, they called them. Demand for their products was through the roof. They had government support, and the future seemed incredibly bright.
Okay, so the classic American success story,
Mm.
but I'm sensing a but coming.
There's always a but, isn't there? The wartime boom spurred a technological revolution in agriculture. Tractors and chemical fertilizers became the norm. All of a sudden, farmers could cultivate more land, produce more crops.
So that's where the but comes in. It sounds like progress, but at what cost?
Exactly. This technological revolution led to a trend towards larger, more industrialized farms. The small family farms that were once the backbone of rural America, they started to struggle to keep up.
So even as American agriculture was booming on the surface, there was this underlying shift happening, a quiet revolution that would have major consequences down the road.
Precisely. And those consequences became all too clear in the 1980s. But to understand how, we need to first look at what fueled the boom of the 1970s.
Okay, so let's talk about the 1970s. It was like a golden age for American farmers, right?
It was. It really seemed that way. Global factors played a huge role. Rising populations, increased wealth, and crop failures in other countries created a massive demand for American grain.
So American farmers had the supply and the world had the demand. It was a recipe for success.
It was. But there's one event in particular that really kicked things into overdrive. The Great Grain Robbery of 1972.
Great grain robbery.
Huh?
That sounds like something out of a movie.
It was like something out of a movie. The Soviet Union secretly bought up a massive chunk of the U.S. wheat crop. It caught everyone by surprise, and it tripled prices practically overnight.
Wow. I bet American farmers were popping champagne corks.
You bet they were. It created this euphoria, this sense that the good times would never end. Land prices skyrocketed, and farmers were encouraged to borrow heavily to expand their operations.
It sounds almost too good to be true, like a bubble waiting to burst.
And that's exactly what it was. The 1970s were a time of immense opportunity for American farmers. But it was a decade built on a foundation of debt and an almost blind faith in the continued growth of global demand.
So beneath that gleaming surface of prosperity, there were cracks starting to form, cracks that would eventually widen to a full-blown crisis.
Exactly. And that's where our story takes a dramatic turn as we enter the fateful decade of the 1980s.
This is getting good. We've set the stage. We've seen the seeds of both prosperity and crisis being sown in the decades leading up to the 1980s. Now I'm ready to see how it all unfolds.
Well, then you won't want to miss what comes next. Buckle up, because things are about to get really interesting. Okay, so we're on the edge of this precipice. The 1970s are winding down, and the American farm economy is, it sounds weird to say, but it's like a house of cards built on a foundation of gold.
That's a pretty vivid image. I get what you mean, though. There's this sense of fragility, despite the outward appearance of success.
Right, and all it takes is one gust of wind to knock the whole thing down.
So what was a gust of wind that brought the whole thing crashing down in the 1980s?
Well, there were actually a few gusts. Let's start with the Federal Reserve. They brought in this new guy, Paul Volcker, to be the chairman, and he was determined to tackle inflation.
Volcker. Okay.
Yeah.
I remember learning about him in school. He was kind of a big deal, right?
Oh, he was a big deal, all right. He came in with this radical plan to raise interest rates. And, really raise them.
I'm starting to see where this is going. All those farmers who had borrowed heavily to expand their operations, suddenly their loans became a lot more expensive.
Exactly. Their debt payments skyrocketed overnight. Many farmers simply couldn't keep up.
Ouch. That had to hurt. But wasn't there also something about a grain embargo?
Oh, yeah, I almost forgot about that. In 1980, President Carter imposed a grain embargo on the Soviet Union after they invaded Afghanistan.
So on top of these sky-high interest rates,
Mhm.
American farmers lost access to one of their biggest export markets. Talk about a one-two punch.
It was a devastating combination. Land values, which had been soaring for years, suddenly plummeted. Farmers were going bankrupt left and right. Foreclosures and farm auctions became a tragically common sight.
It's heartbreaking to think about all those families who lost their farms, their livelihoods, their way of life.
It was a dark time for rural America. The human cost of this crisis is immeasurable. The stress, the anxiety, the despair, it all took a heavy toll.
And it wasn't just the farmers themselves, right? Entire communities must have been affected.
Absolutely. Small towns across the heartland were hollowed out. Businesses closed, schools consolidated, people packed up and moved away, seeking better opportunities elsewhere.
It's like the fabric of rural America was being unraveled thread by thread.
That's a good way to put it. And the tragedy is that so much of this could have been prevented.
What do you mean?
There were warning signs all along, people raising concerns about the unsustainable nature of the agricultural boom, but their voices were largely ignored.
So it was like a train wreck in slow motion. Everyone could see it coming, but no one could stop it.
That's a pretty apt analogy. But even amidst all this darkness, there were glimmers of hope, stories of resilience and community spirit that shine through.
I like the sound of that.
Yeah.
Tell me more about those glimmers of hope.
One of the most inspiring things to emerge from this crisis was the phenomenon of penny auctions.
Penny auctions, what are those?
So, when a farm was being foreclosed on, a community would come together and intentionally bid pennies on the property
Why would they do that?
to keep the price artificially low so that the family who lost the farm could buy it back for next to nothing. It was a way of protecting their own.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Talk about the power of community.
Right. It was a beautiful thing to see. And on a larger scale, the plight of American farmers started to gain national attention.
Yeah, I remember hearing about Farm Aid, those huge concerts with Willie Nelson and Neil Young and all those other big names.
Exactly. Farm Aid was a direct response to the crisis. It brought the issue to the forefront of the American consciousness, and it raised millions of dollars to help struggling farmers.
It's amazing how music can be such a powerful force for good.
It really is. Farm Aid was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope, and there are always people who care.
So we've seen the devastation of the farm crisis, but we've also seen the strength and resilience of the human spirit. It's a story of both tragedy and hope.
It is, and it's a story that continues to shape rural America to this day. But to really understand the lasting impact of the crisis, we need to shift our focus to the aftermath.
Okay, so let's talk about the aftermath. What happened after the dust settled? Did things ever go back to the way they were before?
That's a great question. And the answer is complicated. The 1980s farm crisis was a watershed moment. It changed the face of American agriculture forever, and its effects are still being felt today. But that's a story for another time.
Okay, so the 1980s are over, the dust has settled, but I have a feeling the story doesn't end there.
Oh, not at all. The 1980s farm crisis was a turning point in American agricultural history, and its ripple effects are still being felt today.
Okay, so paint me a picture. What did the landscape of American agriculture look like after this crisis?
Well, one of the most obvious changes was the continued decline in the number of farms. Remember back in 1945, there were almost 6 million farms? By the early 1990s, that number had dropped to just over 2 million.
Wow. So even after the immediate crisis passed, that trend towards fewer and bigger farms just kept on going.
It did. And as the number of farms dwindled, the average size of those farms grew, we saw the rise of large-scale industrial agriculture operations.
Okay, so it was like survival of the fittest. The farms that could adapt to this new reality, they survived. But what about the ones that couldn't?
Many families were forced to leave the land. They had to sell their farms and move to urban areas to find work.
I can't imagine how difficult that must have been, to leave behind a way of life that had been in your family for generations.
It was a traumatic experience for many, and it had a ripple effect on entire communities. Small towns across the heartland were hollowed out, businesses closed, schools consolidated. It was a really tough time.
It's almost like the farm crisis created these ghost towns all across rural America.
That's a pretty accurate description, and the sad thing is that many of these communities never fully recovered.
So the crisis had these long-lasting effects, not just on individual farmers, but on the very fabric of rural America.
Exactly. It changed the demographics, it changed the economy, it changed the social structure of these communities.
It's like a wound that never fully healed.
That's a good way to put it. But amidst all this loss and hardship, there were also some positive changes that emerged from the crisis.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, for one thing, it forced farmers to become more innovative. They had to diversify their crops, experiment with new farming methods, and find new ways to market their products.
So it was like they had to adapt or die.
Exactly. And this led to a resurgence of interest in things like organic farming and direct-to-consumer sales. Think farmers markets and community-supported agriculture programs.
So the crisis kind of pushed farmers to think outside the box.
It did, and it also led to some important changes at the policy level.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, the Farm Bill, which is the main piece of legislation governing U.S. agricultural policy, It underwent a major overhaul in response to the crisis.
So the government stepped in to try to prevent something like this from happening again.
Yeah, they introduced things like crop insurance and disaster relief programs to provide a safety net for farmers.
So it wasn't all doom and gloom. There were some positive outcomes that came out of this difficult period.
Right. It's like the saying goes, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I think that applies to American agriculture as well.
I like that. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the 1980s farm crisis, what are some of the key takeaways you'd like our listeners to remember?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that this crisis wasn't just about economics. It was about people. It was about families. It was about communities. And it was about a way of life that was under threat.
And it's a reminder that even in the face of adversity, the human spirit can endure, and we can learn and grow from our mistakes.
Absolutely. And the lessons we learned from the 1980s farm crisis are still relevant today.
Yeah.
As we face new challenges like climate change and globalization, we need to find ways to create a more sustainable and equitable food system.
Well said. So thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the 1980s farm crisis. It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking conversation.
My pleasure. And to our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep exploring the world around you.
That's right, folks. Until next time, stay curious and keep on diving deep.